In the autumn of 1887, in a high valley of the Colorado Territory, where the first hard frost came before October's end and the creek ran cold enough to numb a hand in 30 seconds, the Pried County School Board posted a condemnation notice on the door of the Harlan Creek Schoolhouse and walked away. The notice declared the building unsafe for assembly. It named subsidence as the cause. It said nothing about what lay beneath the floor. The woman who bought the building 6 weeks later was 26 years old. She paid $2 for it at the county tax auction, an amount that drew a short, surprised laugh from the man at the clerk's table, and a restrained murmur from the 3 other bidders who had come to see what kind of fool would claim a structure the county had already condemned. Her name was Vera Mack. She had $41 to her name, a mason's iron probe she carried in the inside pocket of her coat, and a working knowledge of underground stone that her grandfather had spent 12 years placing in her hands before the Tomochi Creek mine took him in the winter of 1882. She had come to the valley on foot, following the creek road from the stage stop at Benton's Crossing, carrying a canvas pack and wearing her grandfather's old survey boots, which were half a size too large and had been re-soled twice. She had no family left in Colorado. She had a letter of character from a land surveyor in Leadville who had employed her for 18 months reading ground for a mine assessment, and she had the probe, which was 7/8 of an inch in diameter, 24 inches long, and had been forged by a blacksmith in Gunnison to her grandfather's specification. She had nothing else worth noting. The schoolhouse sat on a slope above Harlan Creek, tilted 3 degrees east because something beneath its north corner had shifted. Everyone in the valley knew about the lien. The school board had known about it for 2 years before the condemnation. The county surveyor had known about it. They had all looked at the angle of the north wall and decided the ground beneath it was bad, which, in mountain country, is not an unreasonable conclusion. Ground moves, slopes settle. Buildings built on slopes sometimes follow. She looked at the lien and decided something had moved beneath it. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Her grandfather had taught her the distinction before she was tall enough to see over a dry stone wall. Settled ground sinks in broad, gradual curves, pulling a structure down uniformly across a wide base. Disturbed ground drops in a line, a sharp, clean deflection concentrated in a narrow zone because a void has been opened and something has been placed in it that compresses differently over time than the surrounding fill. The schoolhouse did not sag. It listed, clean and deliberate, along the north wall's footing, as if the earth beneath one specific corner had been removed and replaced with material that had been compressing under load for 15 or 20 years. She had seen that pattern in 3 other structures in her working life: a stone-floored root cellar in Saguache County, an assay office in Poncha Springs, and a freight depot in the Wet Mountain Valley. Each time someone had dug. She told no one this on the day of the auction. She raised her hand at $2 and kept it still when the man at the table called the amount a second time, looking around at the other bidders to see if anyone cared to better it. No one did. She took the deed receipt, folded it into her coat pocket beside the probe, and walked back up the slope to look at the building she had just purchased for the cost of a dinner. The schoolhouse was a single room, roughly 24 feet by 18, built of squared pine logs with a board and batten exterior and a shake roof that had been repaired unevenly across its 30-year life. The door was padlocked with a county seal on the hasp. She had asked the clerk for the key when she took the deed receipt, and the clerk had produced it from a drawer with the expression of someone handing over something of no further use to anyone. Inside, the benches and the teacher's desk had been removed, presumably by the school board before the condemnation, and the room was empty, except for a cracked slate blackboard still mounted on the east wall, and the cold chalk and pine smell that old schoolrooms carry long after the children are gone. The floor was slate, 22 slabs laid in 4 rows across the front, 2/3 of the room, each slab roughly 30 inches by 18. The seams mortared with a lime mix that had been original to the building's construction in 1857. At the back of the room, behind where the teacher's desk had stood, the slabs gave way to bare board, 3 wide planks covering the raised platform where the desk had sat. She spent 4 hours on her knees that first afternoon, working the width of the slate floor with the probe, and then with her palms. The probe told her the floor was sound under all 4 rows except along the northeast quadrant. In the northeast quadrant, under 3 adjacent slabs near the back corner, the feedback from the probe was not what solid aggregate gives back. It was fractionally lighter, fractionally less even, the kind of resonance that a packed fill gives rather than the original tamped bass. The difference is small. Few hands would catch it through the shaft of a probe. She had been catching it since she was 14 years old. The mortar told her more. She examined the joints between the northeast slabs. With a candle she had brought in her pack, holding it low and moving it along the lines of mortar at an oblique angle so the light raked across the surface. Original mortar, 30 years old, is pitted on both faces of the joint from decades of fine dust and the cycling of moisture and cold. Reset mortar is smoother because it was set more recently and has had fewer years to acquire that weathering. The distinction is subtle but reliable. One slab in the northeast corner, the one immediately behind where the teacher's desk would have stood, had mortar that was smooth along its north edge and pitted along its south. The north edge had been reset, not recent. The smoothness was, itself, years old, more than a decade by her estimate. But it had been reset inside the schoolhouse's working life, and it had been reset by someone who had a reason to lift that slab and set it back down. She stood up, put the candle out, and carried the probe back to the door. She stood in the open doorway and looked at the north wall's lean, from a foot away, then from 10 feet back, then from the tree line at the edge of the slope. She looked at the lean for a long time, the way her grandfather had taught her to look at ground that was telling you something. You do not interpret it too fast. You let it tell you at its own pace. Then she went down the slope to find Calhoun Reese. Calhoun Reese had been on Harlan Creek for 34 years, which was longer than the schoolhouse had stood. He was 68 years old, built close to the ground, with a face that had been weathered to the color of old saddle leather and hands so work-thickened he could barely straighten the first 2 fingers of his right hand anymore. He had a habit of looking at the ground when he spoke, which Vera had learned in 2 brief conversations was not evasiveness, but precision, the way a careful man organizes his words before he releases them. He ran 4 cows on the creek's west bank and kept a summer garden and had, by Vera's observation, seen enough of human enterprise to be difficult to impress and nearly impossible to alarm. She told him what she had found in plain terms, without inflection. She showed him with her hands the difference between the probe feel of solid aggregate and the probe feel of introduced fill. She told him that one slab in the northeast corner had been lifted and reset sometime in the 1,870 seconds, and that the 3 slabs in the northeast quadrant together were covering something below grade that was not original to the floor's construction. Calhoun looked at the ground beside the creek for a long time. A cold wind moved through the cottonwoods along the bank and the water flashed where it turned around a submerged stone. He did not speak for nearly a minute. "Maddox," he said. The word came out quietly, not as an accusation, more the way you say a name that you have been holding in your mouth for a long time and have finally found the occasion to set down. The name was Orville Maddox. He had been, in sequence, the managing superintendent of the Harlan Creek Gravel Company from 1861 to 1871, the founding trustee of the Harlan Creek School District from 1871 to 1877, and a man who had died in 1879, leaving behind a son, a house in Salida, and a reputation in the valley that was more complicated than his obituary had recorded. Calhoun told the story the way he told everything, slowly and without embellishment. The gravel company had worked the creek's upper valley from the late summer of 1861 onward, pulling placer gold from the gravel beds in the creek and from 3 small bench deposits on the valley's east wall. It had been a legitimate enough operation in its first year. The trouble began in 1862 when the company pushed its operations southward along the creek and began working ground that 3 homestead families had already claimed under the Territorial Preemption Act. The families were the Roans, the Pelks, and a widow named Agnes Sutter, whose husband had died of fever in the second summer after their arrival. All 3 had their preemption claims properly filed at the county seat. All 3 had been working their land for at least a year before the gravel company moved onto it. What Maddox had done, Calhoun said, was continue working the ground anyway. He had written letters to the Territorial Land Office disputing the validity of the homestead claims on the basis that the families had not been in continuous residence, a claim that Calhoun characterized, with careful understatement, as not reflecting the facts as he himself had witnessed them. The Land Office had taken 18 months to respond. During those 18 months, the company had extracted what it extracted, and the records that went to the Territorial Mining Commission when the matter finally came to adjudication in 1873 reflected, in Calhoun's opinion, not what the company had taken. The commission had ruled in 1873 in favor of the 3 families on the homestead question and had ordered mineral rights compensation. The compensation had been calculated against the ledger figures Maddox had produced. The 3 families had received a sum. Calhoun did not say the sum was not paid. He said he had always believed the sum was not correct. He built the schoolhouse in 1871, Calhoun said, year after he lost the ruling. There was a pause between them. The water turned around the stone in the creek. Vera watched Calhoun's hands and waited. He was trustee for 6 years, Calhoun said. He had keys to that building longer than anyone else in this valley. She asked him if he would help her open the floor. She told him what tools she would need and what she expected to find, and what she intended to do with it if her expectation proved correct. She did not ask him to decide anything on behalf of anyone else. She asked him only to be present, as a man who had been in the valley when the company operated and who knew the ground. He went back to his place and came back with a pry bar and a coal oil lantern and a woman Vera had not asked for and had not expected. Her name was Della Roan. She was 43 years old, the granddaughter of Emmett Roan, whose name was on the original homestead claim. She was a compact, quiet-faced woman with close-cut, dark hair, and the kind of stillness that is not passivity, but something closer to its opposite, an alertness so steady, it read as calm. She had lived in the valley her entire life. She had been 7 years old when the commission ruled, and had grown up knowing what the ruling had given her family, and knowing, in the way that children absorb the knowledge, adults will not speak directly, that the giving had not been complete. She held the lantern with both hands, and did not say anything when Vera looked at her. She did not need to explain why she was there, and Vera did not ask. Some truths require a witness. Not for legal purposes, though the law has its own reasons for witnesses, for the truth itself, which in the moment of its emergence needs at least one person in the room who has been waiting for it long enough to receive it with the weight it deserves. If you have ever stood in a room where something was about to come to light, something that had been buried long enough that everyone had stopped expecting it. Leave a thought below. That waiting is its own kind of labor. And she understood that afternoon that Della Roan had been doing it since before she could read. She began with the northeast corner slab, the one with the reset mortar. She had brought the chisel and the probe and the camp trowel. Calhoun had brought the pry bar. She placed the chisel at the north edge of the slab where the mortar was smoothest and worked it in along the joint with steady incremental pressure. Slate is a layered stone, and it will crack along those layers if you rush it or apply force at an angle to the grain. Her grandfather had worked slate in his survey jobs and had taught her its properties the way he taught her everything, through the hands first and the explanation afterward. She kept the chisel at a consistent angle and let the pressure do the work. The mortar released along the joint in a series of dry, fine cracks. The sound of material that has held its position for a long time and has forgotten how to move. She worked the full perimeter of the slab before she touched the pry bar, which was discipline her grandfather had called the difference between opening a thing and breaking it. When she put the pry bar in at the north edge and lifted, the slab came up in one piece. 30 by 18 inches of dark, Sangre de Cristo slate, cold and heavy, and she set it to the side on the board platform and looked at what was beneath it. Packed earth, clean fill, dark, and deliberately introduced, not the tamped gravel aggregate that underlaid the rest of the floor. She could see where the original base material had been cut away at the slab's perimeter, the cut line sharp in the paler surrounding material, the work of a tool rather than natural subsidence. Someone had dug a cavity beneath this slab, filled it with a different material, and reset the slab over it. The fill had compressed under the slab's weight over the intervening years, which explained part of the north wall's lean. A small but real settlement, distributed across the 3 adjacent slabs in the northeast quadrant, had pulled the north footing down a fraction. The building had been telling the truth all along. No one had known how to listen. She took the probe and pushed it into the center of the filled cavity. The probe went in 14 inches and stopped against something that gave no further. The resistance was flat and uniform, the feedback of a man-made surface rather than a stone or a buried timber. She moved the probe 2 inches and pushed again. The same resistance, the same depth, the same flat feel. She moved it a third time to the opposite side of center. Identical. She put the probe aside and took the trowel and began to dig. She worked carefully, moving the fill in measured amounts, keeping the excavation clean-edged. The fill was dark, topsoil mixed with creek sand, which was not native to the schoolhouse site, and had therefore been transported, a detail she noted, without speaking it aloud. Someone had done this quietly and deliberately and had replaced the slab so precisely that 30 years of students had walked over it, and no one had noticed anything but a slightly uneven corner. At 11 inches, her fingertips found the surface. She widened the excavation to the edges of the fill zone. She kept digging careful now to move material away from the perimeter rather than across the surface she was uncovering. At 14 inches with the lantern close, and Della Roan holding it steady with both hands, she could see what she had found, a wooden box. Clear pine, fitted joint construction, sealed around the lid joint with a tar pitch that had cracked in the years of temperature change but had not failed. Approximately 18 inches square and 4 inches deep. A document box built on the same form as the survey record boxes she had seen in her grandfather's work. The proportions of a thing meant to hold flat papers in quantity without folding them. She got her hands under the edges and lifted it free of the fill. It was heavier than she had expected and lighter than she had feared. She set it on the slate floor between her knees. Calhoun Reese had not moved or spoken since the slab came up. He stood against the east wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on the box and his face entirely still. Vera worked the chisel under the lid joint at one corner and pried gently, using the tool the way her grandfather had taught her to use it, as a lever with a known fulcrum, controlled and precise. The tar at the joint cracked in a dry, fine line and then released, and the lid came free with a sound like a room exhaling the cold, sealed air from inside the box, coming out in a single quiet breath, carrying with it a smell of old paper and the particular dryness of a space that had been closed for more than 15 years. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth folded 3 layers deep, were the working ledgers of the Harlan Creek Gravel Company, 4 of them bound in brown calfskin, 1 per operating year, from 1862 through 1865. She could see the years on the spine labels, written in a round, deliberate hand. She did not open them there. She set the oilcloth package on the floor beside the box and, beneath where the ledgers had lain, found a second wrapped packet, smaller, which she opened and found to contain 16 handwritten assay reports bearing dates from February of 1862 to October of 1865, each signed by the same assaying concern and each carrying the company's operational stamp. And beneath the assay reports, folded once and wrapped separately in a single layer of oilcloth, a pre-printed Territorial Mining Commission form, the kind issued before the war for establishing mineral rights concession agreements, filled in by hand, dated March of 1861 and signed by Orville Maddox and 2 other men whose names she did not yet recognize. She read the cover of each ledger. She looked at the first page of the earliest assay report without reading it in full. She looked at the concession form long enough to understand what it was. Then she rewrapped everything with the same care she had unwrapped it, folded the oilcloth back in its original creases, and placed the package in the lid of the box. Delarone was very still beside her. The lantern flame did not waver. "Are those the company's real accounts?" Della said. She did not say it as a question that needed an answer, but as one that had been forming inside her for 40 years. "They are the originals," Vera said. "The ones presented to the commission were prepared copies. These are what the company actually recorded." She said it the way her grandfather had taught her to say a certain thing, plainly and without softening it, because a plain truth is less cruel than a softened one. She did not look up when she said it. There were things that would follow from what was in this box. She could not enumerate all of them yet. But she knew that a set of original ledgers against a set of commission-era copies constitutes a specific kind of argument, one that does not require a voice to make. She rose from her knees and picked up the box. The schoolhouse was cold. It smelled of chalk and earth and the cracked tar of the seal. The last light of the November afternoon came through the south window at a low angle and lay across the slate floor in a long rectangle that reached to the edge of the open cavity. She looked at the cavity for a moment, at the cut perimeter, in the pale original aggregate, at the dark fill, still partly in place, around the excavation center. "We take this to the county clerk," she said. "Not the land office, and not the assayer's office. The county clerk has the homestead documents on file. That is where we begin." Calhoun uncrossed his arms and straightened from the wall. He nodded once, not in agreement, exactly, more in the way a man nods when a thing he has been thinking about for a long time is finally being said aloud by someone else. Delarone said nothing. She held the lantern until they were ready to leave, and then extinguished it at the door, and they walked down the slope in the last of the autumn light. The 3 weeks between the opening of the box and the visit to the county clerk were the densest of her working life. She borrowed a table in Calhoun Reese's front room and spread the ledgers across it, one at a time, and read them as her grandfather had taught her to read a column of figures, not for the individual entries, but for the structure, the way a ledger's architecture tells you whether the accounting is describing reality. The Harlan Creek Gravel Company's original ledgers were describing reality. They were the daily operational accounts of a placer mining concern that knew exactly what it was taking out of the ground and what it was paying, and what the difference between those two figures amounted to. The figures in the original ledgers and the figures in the commission-era copies were not the same. She had requested the commission copies from the county clerk's file on the second day, citing her ownership of the property from which the originals had been recovered, and Holt, the clerk, had produced them from the archives after an hour's search. She laid the copies beside the originals and worked through them column by column across 3 days, noting each discrepancy in her own hand on a fresh sheet. The discrepancies were systematic. The extraction figures in the commission-era copies were consistently lower than the originals by a margin that was not the kind of error that accumulates from loose accounting. It was the kind of margin that results from a decision. In the years 1862 through 1864, the copies showed the company extracting roughly 60% of what the originals recorded. In 1865, the last full year of the relevant period, the copy showed the assay reports confirmed the original ledger figures. The pre-war concession form established the mineral rights framework on which the Commission had based its 1873 ruling. And it established that framework in terms considerably more specific than what the Commission had been shown. She was not a lawyer. She did not need to be. The arithmetic was arithmetic. The signatures on the documents were legible and consistent. The physical condition of the originals, the wear on the calfskin covers, the browning of the ink at the page edges, the compression of the paper from years of storage in a sealed space, spoke clearly to their age and authenticity. What she assembled was not an argument. It was a record. 12 pages in her hand, cross-reference to the specific ledger pages and assay entries and commission documents, organized in the order a clerk would find useful, plain and sequential, with nothing added for effect and nothing left out for convenience. She worked until the lamp oil ran low each night and started again each morning, when the light came good enough to read by. She had been taught that the first obligation of a found truth is not to the person who found it. The county clerk, whose name was Holt, had been in his position for 11 years. He was a methodical man with round spectacles and a habit of holding documents at arm's length to read them, which gave him the look of someone perpetually surprised. He received the oilcloth package with both hands when Vera laid it on his desk and set it down carefully, without opening it, and listened to what she told him. She told it in order, beginning with the purchase and the probe and the mortar, proceeding through the excavation and the contents of the box, and ending with her 12-page summary and what the comparison of original against copy showed. She did not editorialize. She did not use words like fraud or theft or deliberate, not because those words were wrong, but because the document said them more clearly than she could. Holt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he opened the package and looked at the ledger covers, and then at the spines, and then at the first page of the 1862 ledger, and then at the assay reports, and then at the pre-war concession form, each in turn for a long time each. He picked up her summary document and read the first 2 pages standing at his desk. Then he set the pen down that he had been holding since she began, and looked at his desk without speaking for a moment. "These will need to go to the Territorial Commission," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know. I have organized this summary to match their documentation format from the 1873 ruling, which is what I based the column-by-column comparison on. The copies they were given in 1873 are in your archive. The originals are in that box. The difference between the two is what the summary describes." Holt looked at her over his spectacles. He was not a man who expressed surprise easily, but she thought there was something near it in his expression. She left the package and the summary with him and walked out of the clerk's office into the cold November air. She did not take copies of her 12-page summary because the summary derived its authority from the documents it accompanied and would have meant nothing without them. What she had done was retrieve and organize and deliver. What happened after was not her decision, which her grandfather had taught her was the proper relationship between the person who finds a truth and the truth itself. The Territorial Commission's review lasted until the following April. She was not present for any of it. She had left Harlan Creek in early December, when the creek road froze over, and the last stage of the season came through the valley. She had spoken to Delarone twice more before she left. The first time was to tell her what the summary showed, and what the likely outcome of the commission review would be, as plainly as she had told it to Holt. The second time was the morning she left, at the junction where the creek road met the main road south, when Della had come down from her place and stood at the junction without saying much. There was not much to say that was useful. Vera was not given to the kind of speech that fills a silence with sound for the sake of filling it. She told Della that the documents were in good hands with Holt, and that the arithmetic would not change regardless of what anyone might prefer it to say. Della had nodded and looked at the road south and said that she supposed it would take as long as it took. Vera said that was her estimate as well. She went south to Salida, and then east to Pueblo, and then north to Cheyenne. Following the work, the Commission's supplemental order came down in April of 1888. It directed Gerald Maddox, Orville's son, now operating the family's dry goods concern in Salida, to submit to a recalculation of the original 1873 settlement against the figures in the original ledgers, and to pay the difference, compounded at the territorial rate for mineral rights compensation, to the documented heirs of the Roan Pelk and Sutter homestead claims. The order was a public document filed at the county seat. No newspaper covered it. Gerald Maddox did not contest the order or make any public statement about it. He paid in installments across 3 years, which the Commission permitted in cases of substantial sum, and the dry goods concern continued to operate, smaller and quieter, and the matter was concluded in the autumn of 1891 without a scene. Delarone received the first installment of her family's share in July of 1888. The Pelt family had scattered to Nevada and Kansas, but the Commission's administrator tracked them through land records and reached 2 of Emmett Pelk's grandsons. Agnes Sutter's daughters, who still farmed her original homestead allotment on the creek's east bank, received their portion by August of the same year. She was in Wyoming for all of it. She had found work on a survey crew out of Cheyenne, reading ground for a railroad right-of-way assessment, and the work was steady and the pay was reliable, and the foreman did not ask her questions she would have had to refuse to answer. She learned of the Commission's order and the payment schedule from a letter Calhoun Reese sent in early May of 1888, written in his careful, compressed hand on a single sheet of paper. He told her what the Commission had decided and how Gerald Maddox had responded, and that Delarone was well. He mentioned at the end that the schoolhouse had been pulled down in February, the county having cleared its interest in the property after the title question resolved, and that the slate floor had been salvaged by a contractor doing foundation work in the next valley over. The school board's condemnation notice, he supposed, had finally had its proper effect, only some months later than intended, and for rather different reasons. Vera read the letter twice, at the window of the rooming house in Cheyenne, where she had taken a room by the month. The Wyoming morning outside was pale and cold, the sky a thin blue that meant more wind coming. She thought about the 22 slabs of dark Sangre de Cristo slate that were now somewhere in the next valley, set into a foundation or a floor or a wall, carrying no visible sign of what one of them had once covered. Stone does not remember. That is one of its properties. The hands that quarried it remember, and the hands that laid it remember, and the hands that lifted it remember. The stone itself is just the material on which the record was kept. Her grandfather had told her something like that once, on a survey job above Pueblo, where they had opened a stone cairn and found inside it a set of notes from another surveyor 30 years old. Notes that the original man had never been able to file because he had died in the winter before he could complete his work, down to the land office. Her grandfather had read the notes carefully, folded them along their original creases, placed them in his own survey case, and carried them down to the land office himself, where he filed them under the dead surveyor's name and said nothing further about it. "The stones are just stones," he had told her on the walk down from the cairn. "It is the finding and the carrying down that matters." She had been 17 years old when he said that. She had not fully understood it until the day she stood in the Harlan Creek Schoolhouse with a probe in her hand and listened to the difference between solid aggregate and introduced fill, and understood that a floor is not a surface but a record, and that the record requires someone who knows how to read it. She put Calhoun's letter in the inside pocket of her coat beside the probe and went down to meet the survey crew at the street below. She worked the Wyoming job through the spring and part of the summer, and then followed a lead south to New Mexico territory, where a man in Santa Fe who had heard of her from the Leadville surveyor had a small commission for her involving an abandoned Spanish land grant and the question of whether a particular acequia boundary had been properly surveyed. Under the original terms, she looked at the property for 3 days and found 4 discrepancies that the grant's claimants had not known about and the contesting party had not disclosed. And she prepared a 12-page report and delivered it to the Land Commission's office in Santa Fe with the same quiet efficiency she had delivered Holt's package in Colorado. The Commission's file on the Harlan Creek Gravel Company was closed and archived in the late autumn of 1891, following the settlement's completion. The closing notation recorded the amounts paid and the names of the recipients and the source document on which the recalculation had been based, including 4 calfskin ledgers, 16 assay reports, and a pre-war concession form, all recovered from a sealed cache beneath the slate floor of the former Harlan Creek Schoolhouse, Pried County, Colorado Territory, by a woman named Vera Mack, who had acquired the property at tax auction in October of 1887 for a sum of $2. The notation recorded the probe. It recorded the $2. It recorded the date of the auction and the date of the recovery and the date the documents were submitted to the clerk. It did not record the cold air that came out of the box when the lid broke free, or the way Delarone had been holding the lantern when it happened, or what Calhoun Reese's face had looked like standing against the east wall in the last of the November afternoon light. Records are not built for those details. They are built for the shape of a resolution, the names and the figures and the dates that constitute the argument. The substance of the story sits between the dates, in the cold and the chalk smell and the $2 paid and the 12 years of a dead man's teaching carried in a living woman's hand. That is not the kind of material a territorial commission's file is designed to hold. It is the kind that travels with the person who did the work, folded close, carried without ceremony, put to use again when the next floor shows the wrong lean. There is always a next floor, if you have been taught to listen. Not to the building, exactly, to the ground beneath it which does not forget what has been disturbed, and which will tell the truth to anyone patient enough to put the probe in the right place and let the material speak. Have you ever looked at something the world had written off and known, without being able to say exactly how you knew that there was more to it than what showed on the surface? Leave a word below. And if a story about a woman who pays $2 for what no one else will touch sounds like the kind of evening you have been looking for, there is another one waiting for you here. The New Mexico work lasted 2 months and produced a second commission. This one from a man in Taos who had a collapsed adobe structure on a grant boundary and needed someone who could read the original survey stakes, most of which had been replaced by wooden markers that had rotted, and reconstruct the line from the stake hole. She spent 6 days in the field doing that, and found the line within a margin the commission accepted. And when she left Taos, she had enough work pending to keep her in the territory through the winter. She thought about the Harlan Creek Schoolhouse occasionally during those months, usually in the early morning before the crew assembled, when the quality of light was similar, a cold lateral light that raked across a surface and showed its texture. That kind of light is useful for reading ground, for reading mortar, for reading any surface that carries the record of what has happened to it. Her grandfather had been a man who woke early and used the morning light before it became too diffuse, and she had inherited that habit along with his probe and his survey boots. She thought about the slab she had lifted and what had been beneath it, and what the difference between original material and introduced fill tells you when you know how to hear it. She thought about the moment the chisel went in at the smooth mortar joint, the mortar that had been reset inside the schoolhouse's working life, and how the chisel had moved through it differently than it would have moved through original mortar, because nothing reset by human hands looks exactly like what was there before. And a careful person can learn to read that difference the way a careful person can learn to read anything. She did not think about it in a sentimental way. She thought about it the way you think about a technique that produced a reliable result, and that you would use again, because the technique was sound and the ground was patient and there were more buildings in the world that leaned the wrong way than anyone had thought to look at carefully. The probe was a good instrument. Her grandfather had been particular about its dimensions because the diameter of the shaft affects the feedback. Too thin and the probe gives you noise. Too thick, and you lose the subtlety of the resistance at the tip. 7/8 of an inch was the specification he had arrived at after years of use, and he had written it down in his survey log in a note he had labeled Instrument Specifications, Practical, and she had found the note after he died and had taken it to the blacksmith in Gunnison as if it were a commission from her grandfather's own hand, which in a sense it was. The probe had been with her through the root cellar in Saguache County, and the assay office in Poncha Springs, and the freight depot in the Wet Mountain Valley, before it was with her in the Harlan Creek Schoolhouse, and each time it had given her the same reliable information, the same distinction between what the ground was and what it had been made to appear to be. She trusted it, the way she trusted her hands, which were the things her grandfather had trained first and last and always, because the hands are the instrument that everything else depends on. The Wyoming survey foreman had said early in that job that she used a probe the way a physician uses a sounding rod, with the kind of attention that suggested she expected the ground to answer back. She had taken that as a useful description. The ground does answer, in its own terms, through its own materials, in the specific language of resistance and resonance that a probe translates for the hands that hold it. The question is whether the hands holding it have been taught to listen. Her grandfather had spent 12 years teaching her. She had spent 12 years learning. The $2 schoolhouse on the Harlan Creek slope had been where those 12 years were put to their fullest use, and the 4 calfskin ledgers were what those years had unlocked, and what those ledgers had unlocked in turn was a debt that had been sitting in the account books of the Roan and Pelkin Sutter families since 1873, accruing interest in the form of years and silence, and the particular kind of knowledge that comes from growing up aware that something was taken from your people and that the taking was called a settlement. Delarone had been 7 years old when the commission issued its 1873 ruling, She was 43 when the lid came off the box in the schoolhouse corner. 36 years is a long time to carry the shape of a wrong without being able to name its precise dimensions. The ledgers gave her the dimensions. The assay reports confirmed them. The pre-war concession form established that the mineral rights arrangement Maddox had presented to the Commission was itself a simplified version of a more specific original agreement that would have altered the calculus of the compensation calculation at its foundation. The Commission's reviewers understood all of this when they received the package. Holt had accompanied the submission with a careful cover memorandum of his own, which he had written without consulting Vera, though she would have recognized his method if she had seen it. The same plain sequential organization she had used in her own summary document, the same refusal to use a word that the documents themselves did not require. In the end, the truth required very few words. It required 4 calfskin ledgers and 16 assay reports and 1 pre-war concession form, and a 12-page summary that organized them in the order a commission needed to follow them. The words that mattered were the ones already written in a round, deliberate hand in 1862 and 1863 and 1864 and 1865 by the men who had been doing the extraction and the accounting and the deliberate transcription of both into a pair of ledgers. The one that told the truth had been beneath a slate floor in a condemned schoolhouse for the better part of 20 years, waiting for someone who knew how to lift the right stone.